Okay. All right, ready? Ready up here? Okay, so let's talk about Japan. Remember, now we're talking about them in the time of European expansion, and Lenny mentioned an important point. The Japan is going to be able to, when as Europeans arrive in most parts of Asia, they're asking for trade. And in many cases, the countries don't necessarily want to trade with them. But as time goes on, the European countries start to more forcefully convince those countries that they should trade with them. Now, Japan, when the modern day comes, is able to sort of kind of like spin it the way they want to so that they don't get as negatively impacted as some of the other countries like China, which Lenny mentioned. But we're going to talk about what happens basically sort of before that. Here's our main idea. Japan at the time of Europe's expansion was a feudal empire ruled by the shogun and reacted to European contact by shutting it out. That's to start. Later, we're talking 1850s later, the Japan's going to open up to European technology and culture and or Western technology and culture, we could say. So a couple facts about Japan. There are many religions in Japan. Buddhism, Taoism, Shintoism, Confucianism. And that's when the Europeans arrive there. Nowadays, you could pick any major world religion, it'll probably be there. The word Japan is a European name. Nick? Yeah, the dominant language is Japanese. And in many cases, you'll see that this is part of building an empire. And one of the things that often they'll choose to do is standardize the language. When you look at a modern language, any language you've got to go learn in language, our modern language classes or whatever. Those languages usually are the reason that everybody in a country speaks that language is because they wiped out either they killed all the people that spoke the other languages or they simply eliminated that language. Once countries form nations, they start to standardize the language. They start to make it so that if you're in the French nation, then everybody's going to speak French. If you're in the Spanish nation, everybody's going to speak Spanish. And that's done for a lot of reasons. So there were other people in Japan or in these islands besides what people would call the Japanese, and that's true with just about any empire. The closer word in Japanese for Japan is Nippon or Nihon. So, but yeah, they're not really sure where the word Japan came from, but that's what Europeans and Westerners have called it. Okay, Japanese culture has some sort of homegrown stuff to it, but in many cases has sort of borrowed and brought in things from Chinese culture. Now, since Japan's an island, it can kind of pick and choose what it lets in as long as it can control its coastline. This is sort of an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time for island countries, is that if they have a strong navy, it's really easy to protect themselves from invaders. They just make sure the invaders don't land any troops, and they're good, kind of like England. And then they can send out their own ships to go conquer other places. But if you don't have a navy and you don't have the resources to protect yourself, being an island nation can be very bad, because raiders and people that want to either raid with you or trade with you can show up very quickly, and there's not much you could do about it. The case in point here is the island of Ireland, which never really developed a navy and was subject to Viking and Norman raids for hundreds of years. Anyway, so Chinese culture, like I said, was adopted by the Japanese. When Westerners show up, the Japanese are generally open to that culture, and eventually, like Lenny said, they're gonna outdistance the Chinese in terms of technology in the 20th century. Anyway, there's a haiku question on the SMART assessment because it used to be on the final, so it's not anymore. But make sure you know what haiku is. Okay, so we have a similar system just like we had in Europe. All right, Europe, we had kings who weren't like we think of kings that have ultimate power. They ruled really with the backing of their nobles, because the nobles were the guys that had all the weapons and the knights and the castles, and they gave their support to the king and kept the king in power. Then the nobles had their knights, and then there were the peasants who, worked the land, grew the food, created the wealth. Japan's got the same sort of similar thing. Their nobles are the daimyo. They hold the land. The peasants live on the land. The peasants grow the food. That's what creates wealth. So that's the daimyo. Now, from the daimyo, a shogun is chosen, and this person is the warlord. Now, again, they don't rule with ultimate authority. They don't get to. Justin, you okay? All right. Are you taking notes? How are you doing with your head down? Okay. Do you need to take a walk or something? All right. So the shogun rules over them, but again, his rule isn't always stable. You need a pass though. Mr. Wants is going to get you pass. And then the samurai are like the knights. They're called servants, but they're rich nobles too. The emperor is there. He really has no political function or authority. He's sort of a figurehead. So it's almost like you have the shogun and the emperor, and they're both sort of at the top, but only one of them actually kind of runs the show. The other one's sort of a figurehead. And the emperor in Japanese culture, even to this day, to some extent, is considered the descendant of a god. Is a demigod in a way. Okay, so you've got warring. Make sure you're on the notes, okay? You've got warring warlords, and in a lot of cases, it's tough for any one person to control the whole island because they, some other side, we'll build a coalition, a daimyo, we're going to go take over stuff, but then they'll build another alliance and they'll fight it back, and it's all sort of mixed up. But this guy here, Oda Nobunaga, with the adoption of gunpowder, was able to unify the entire island, or the 4 islands. Why is that? Well, one of the ways that you could avoid, that you could protect yourself if you're a daimyo is you build a big castle. And then you have your samurai protect the castle and, nobody can get to you. But Nobunaga, with the use of firearms, especially cannon, was able to develop a way that you could knock somebody's castle walls down. That's really what they're using cannon for right at the beginning in gunpowder. Now, the gunpowder, we say gunpowder, but its first use wasn't really for guns as we think of them as for cannon. Because even if a cannon wasn't very accurate, you could still put something really heavy in it, get it up close to the castle wall, and, blow the whole thing up and then go in there and, start killing some dudes. So anyway, Nobunaga basically unifies Japan with the use of gunpowder. Now, when Europeans start showing up around the 1500s, the interactions are generally positive. Again, when Christian missionaries showed up to the Islamic world, the response from Muslims would be, we've already got the right message, and we're already worshiping the one God the right way, so, shove off. But when they arrive in Japan, the idea of a God is not the same as what the Christians are selling, so in many cases they can kind of tie local religions together. And Japan realized at the beginning that isolation, shutting themselves off, wasn't really an option. So they adopt muskets and cannon and things like that. But Josh, good job. I just want to make sure your eyes are open. I want to make sure you can see. Well, your notes. You have to open your notes. There we go. The last part? I'm going to explain that. So here's what happens. Because the samurai are the elite. They're the rich in this society. The reason that anybody ever seen the movie 300? That's kind of an old movie now in a way. All right. The Spartans, the reason that they can train for this military lifestyle is because somebody else does all the work of growing food. And even though the 300 paints the Spartans as these guys who were fighting for freedom, they were fighting for their freedom. They were slaveholders. So same thing happens with knights or with samurai. Somebody else is growing the food. That's how you go and you train for war, is you get somebody else who has to grow all the food while you train for warfare. So you got these samurai who've trained their whole lives as warriors. They've also trained, samurai was not just about being a warrior, but also about some of the other finer arts like beautiful writing and poetry and things like that. So, but here's the problem. The gun shows up, and all of a sudden, the expertise and the training of a samurai who's at the top of the social ladder, basically, can be wiped out by somebody with a gun. Some knucklehead who gets some gunpowder and a couple of bullets can kill a samurai without any real training. So they get rid of gunpowder because it has a chance of totally rearranging their society. You would think, why wouldn't people want the best weapons? They didn't want that because it would make the samurai basically almost useless. You could train someone for 2 weeks and they could start killing samurai who have been training for years to get to where they were. Okay, so Europeans show up. Eventually, they begin to outlaw Christianity because Christianity often, in Christianity, the ultimate allegiance is to God, right? And so, in a lot of cases, there might have been Christians within Japan who were saying, "I don't really have to obey, the Lord of the daimyo or the shogun because they're not, they're not really following the right God anyway. So why do I need to follow them?" So eventually, the shogun started to outlaw Christianity. So they got rid of countries like England and Portugal because when they showed up, they were trying to tell everyone, about the Christianity. So the Dutch, on the other hand, were the only ones who were pretty much allowed to stay because whenever the Dutch showed up to places, they were not really interested in spreading Christianity. They just wanted to trade, make money, do their thing. Okay. All right. The last part we're talking about is Southeast Asia. This is sort of what we would call modern day, like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They happen to be along trade routes. So in many cases, you still have European countries showing up there. The Portuguese, they're into the spice trade. The Spanish, they show up and they take over the Philippines. They spread Christianity. The Dutch do their trading thing, and that's mostly in Indonesia. Glad you're keeping up to date. The French show up there, and they're actually going to hold on to the colonies that they have there right up until the 1950s. That's one of the origins of the Vietnam War, is the French colonization of what's called French Indochina, but then was called Vietnam. There were kingdoms in there, and we mentioned them just to make sure that everybody doesn't think that it was just Europeans showing up and, conquering, people running around like crazy. Anyway. All right, let's wrap up there. Take 4 minutes. Look over the SMART assessment